Thank you for listening to Mobility Redefined, brought to you by Modaxo. For more insights and information, please visit mobilityredefined.com. That is mobilityredefined.com. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us at SITCE 2024 for this edition of Mobility Redefined podcast recording. We are very pleased to be back in Singapore for this conference because Singapore is hosting a lot of innovations in urban mobility. And one of the innovations that Singapore was hosting in the recent years was transition of bus contracting model. Could you please explain to us the reasons behind that you implemented this reform in Singapore, and were there any changes required in terms of the financial perspective and legal perspective while you were implementing new bus contracting model in Singapore?
Well, first of all, Kaan, thanks for having me. Glad to be hosting the SITCE again. As far as your question goes, why did we move into the bus contracting model? It's quite simple. Historically, Singapore's bus operations were run as a duopoly. So the two incumbent operators had territorial monopoly. There wasn't much contestability because they were allocated areas to operate. And we also found that there was a lack of innovation that probably could have been a little bit more enhanced with contestability in the market. Also, because the operators were privately operated, they were bottom line conscious. And so the investments that we wanted to see in terms of capacity provision was just in time and just enough. And so we weren't content with the state of affairs, and we wanted to move into a more contestable framework. And thereby, we could dictate the service provisions in line with service expectations out there and the changing travel demand. And that was principally the reason why we embarked on the bus contracting model. You've asked also about what it takes, how did we really facilitate it. We had to come out with new legislation, and also the financing framework went under changes. But it's all been quite smooth in the process, and it's necessary because you are transiting to a brand new operating model for the bus. We also took the decision to own the assets, which is a little bit different from how other people would operate the bus contracting model. We took a deliberate policy decision to own the buses and the depots. These are competitive factors in bus contracting. But with the ownership of these infrastructure, it lowers the entry barrier and allows more bidders to come in, more bus operators to come and contest the market.
Thank you, Jeremy. I think it was very important for this ownership model because this increased your attractivity for the operators to bring them to Singapore to enter into operations for the buses in Singapore. And especially after COVID-19, what we see is that there is a growing interest to the bus contracting model in different parts of the world. And when you look at your experience, what kind of benefits you are seeing that these cities that are considering bus contracting model for moving to this approach?
Sure, I'll be happy to share some of the benefits that we are seeing. One principal benefit is really about the service satisfactions. Service level satisfactions by bus commuters. After all, commuters are at the heart of the service provision. So they have, over the period that we've made the transition, from 2013, the bus satisfaction results have gone from 88.5% to 93% in 2023 over the 10-year period. And that was the period in which we transited to the bus contracting model. So public transport satisfaction levels have improved as a result of this model. The second thing I would like to say is the ability to contain cost. Under the gross cost model, which is the foundation of the bus contracting model, operators are better able now to control the costs. There'll be fewer cost overruns operationally and in the areas of maintenance because basically the authority takes the revenue risk. So the operators just have to worry about cost containment. Last but not least, I think the benefits of a contestable model and a bus contracting model invites innovation and technological improvements and service process improvements. So we've seen the bus service levels go up, the bus innovations and technology go up as well, because every tenderer will want to bring to the table new innovations, new areas of improvement. So we've seen even the incumbents rise up to that challenge as a result of the contestable market.
Thank you, Jeremy. You mentioned about costs. And especially if you look from the perspective of cities that are having very tight budgets, what could be your suggestions to them? Because there is a common belief that bus contracting model could be sometimes expensive. What could be your experience to share with them?
I can understand the perspective of cities starting out, and they fear the expense related to gross contracting models or bus contracting models. But the experience that we have undergone has taught us that once you have important cost KPIs in terms of monitoring some of the spending, some of the cost provisions, and looking at some of the standards that you want to maintain without going for immediate pick up in the standards, but graduation of the standards, that helps to control both the provision in terms of the standards and also to manage costs. And the operators are partners with us because we have set certain KPIs of not overspending. The standards are kept in tandem with the spending, because if it's too much over provision, then the operators will naturally overspend. And that comes back as an expense to the authorities. But if we are careful in an incremental fashion to gradually ratchet up service provision standards, then the cost would follow. So I would urge authorities who are starting out on this not to be deterred. The cost elements can be controlled, but it's really in tandem with demand and the kind of standards you want to impose from day one. It doesn't need to be a big bang. It can be a gradual process. It can be incremental.
You also mentioned about asset ownership in this model. And I wonder if you can tell us more about how the roles should be shared between authorities and operators in this model, and especially what are the do's and don't do's in this model for successful collaboration between both parties of authorities and operators.
It's important to be clear about the roles. So for example, because we have taken the decision to own the assets, we will make timely replacement of the assets. But the operators have a corresponding role to make sure that they maintain the assets. So we have maintenance standards for the buses that we regularly audit the operators on. And they know their roles, because if the bus is under-maintained, they will have to top up that difference. And so it will be at the expense of their margin. So they understand this. And it's important also that we see ourselves as the planner. So LTA plans the routes, right? We understand the catchments. We have the planning data. The operators basically need to operate a good service. They need to be mindful of the service levels to commuters. Even though they don't take the revenue risk, it's important for them to still put the commuter at the heart of the service. So they understand that. So in terms of the service and service operations and maintenance, they're very clear about that. And they're very clear about the assets. We own the assets. We are responsible to replace them, but they are correspondingly important to maintain it.
And maybe could you give some examples from these KPIs, especially regarding the service quality that you are implementing under this bus contracting model?
To ensure service quality, what we have as a incentives and disincentives framework. So we have a bus service reliability framework. Basically, it consists of two elements. One is really to track the excess waiting time. And this is very commuter-centric because it measures how much more time the commuter actual waiting time compared to the scheduled waiting time at a particular bus stop. And we also look at on-time arrivals. This we measure at various bus stops. What is the difference between the arrivals and the scheduled arrivals? And so this we're able to look at the service provisions and track it very carefully. If the operators do well, they earn the incentives. Likewise, if they don't do well, it will operate as a disincentive. And the other point I would like to highlight, Kaan, is that in our framework, we have an implicit agreement with the operators that these incentives are passed on to the workers. And I tell you, this is very important because it should not just reflect in the margins of the operators, but if the bus drivers who are principally doing the heavy lifting for keeping those KPIs, it's very important because then there's full alignment. The operators, the bus drivers who are in charge of excess waiting time and on-time arrival, they would be the ones who are reaping the benefits of the incentives. So it's passed on to them instead of just going straight to the company.
And as Singapore, you are benefiting from technology at a very good level. And especially if you look from the perspective of bus contracting model, how technology is helping you to implement this model, particularly in the reliability of the system and managing your relations with the operators.
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked the question. Technology is also an important dimension. But apart from a model shift, we also decided to invest in technology. For example, we invested in a common fleet management system that allows us to track in real time where buses are. And that's very important because Once we're able to do that, it also allows us to put out the information to commuters so that they can have an on-time arrival ability to know how much more time they need to wait at a particular bus stop. If they're not at the bus stop, but somewhere else, let's say drinking a cup of coffee away from the bus stop, they can even access this information through our My Transport app, looking at bus time arrivals on the go, on their phones, so that they can make it in good time to the bus stops for the bus's arrival.
Then also, in terms of using technology for managing your relations between the authorities and operators, are there any insights that you can share with us?
Yeah, the technology helps us also in looking at the mileage runs. And the technology that we have gotten in terms of the common fleet management system is deployed to the operators. And so the service controllers can use that and achieve their KPIs and prevent bus bunching on the routes, because service controllers they talk to the bus drivers on a real-time basis, so that to keep the bus intervals regular and not irregular, so you avoid two buses coming at one time, someone having to wait even longer for a bus.
It's great, actually. It's very impressive to listen how you are crafting all this bus system in Singapore. And as I always say, if there is a country in the world called public transport, it's certainly that Singapore would be its capital city. And Jeremy, before we close, are there any future developments, anything that we can expect from the bus system of Singapore that you would like to share with us?
Thank you, Kaan, for those kind words. I think going forward, we are in the midst of an energy transition. So we have some challenges as well, lest you think that it's always on an upward trend of improvements. So we have to address issues of changing out electrical buses, replacing our diesel buses, and that's going on in a very good and progressive manner. So we're on queue actually to meet some of our KPIs for net zero in 2050, two of which is to replace at least 50% of our bus fleet by 2030. That's well on track because we've already gone out with our first buy of 420 buses, electric buses, to replace our diesel fleet. So they will hit the roads in 2025. And the other KPI is, of course, by 2040, we will have cleaner energy vehicles, all of Singapore and all of our vehicle fleets. Even as we aim towards a halfway mark in 2030, we are well on track to achieve 2040's targets as well.
Thank you, Jeremy. It was great having a discussion with you about the bus transport in Singapore, and then you shared your insights with us and particularly your experience from the bus contracting model. And then looking forward to further developments in Singapore about public transportation.
Thank you, Kaan. It's my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Mobility Redefined, brought to you by Modaxo. For more insights, visit our website at mobilityredefined.com or follow us on LinkedIn. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite app to stay updated with our latest episodes. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation.